writing our own stories. WOOS! Hi everyone, and welcome to WOOS. It's a brand new Barbadian storytelling audio podcast. It gives writers a platform to showcase their works, be it fictional, historical, or modern day truths. This was all inspired by Teddy Calderon and supported by the Intertune project, What's New TV, and Audio Labb Studios. I am your host, Teddy Calderon. But before we get started, please subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell so you know when we release a new story. With that said, our next story is from writer Frank Gilkes. It's called Millie Gone to Brazil. Miss Levine was an old lady who lived on the beach. Not so much that she lived on the beach, but her small, neatly kept wooden house, which we used to call back in those days a house shed, and it was located on the beach. The reason we called it a house shed was because it consisted of a gable roof section and a small attached shed with a flat roof. Miss Levine was a spirited old lady. I used to speculate she was about 100 years old, based on the stories she would tell us as children, but I later understood that she was not as old at that time. However, she did go on to surpass the 100 years mark and left a legacy of being the grand old lady of Sixpence Bay. All the children of the area listened intently as this old lady with her crusty sunburnt skin told us story after story, her entire body gesticulating as she painted pictures in our minds. As a young boy, I always loved stories, and so I was drawn to Miss Levine, the storyteller, and fascinated by her ability to captivate her youthful and respective audience. The story which remains fresh in my memory even now was the one about Millie Gone to Brazil. Of course, we were all familiar with the popular folk song, Millie Gone to Brazil, oh lost, poor Millie. But not many people knew how this song came about. We were very fortunate because Miss Levine would often tell us this story, and each time she told it with almost exact precision. Now, children, she would say, and she would proceed to relate the entire incident of how that folk song came to be. Millie lived with her husband in one of those old soft stone cabins that we used to call slave huts. I guess it was because poor plantation workers used to occupy these structures, which could be found across the country from plantation to plantation. They were sturdily constructed with stone and had only the sand as flooring. Millie and her husband George lived in one of those slave huts at the edge of Haywood Plantation. People used to say how George would come home drunk on a regular basis and how he would beat Millie, but nobody would ever get involved because it seems like the whole district was scared of George. And I can't understand that, since this man was a huge black man with some large and rough hands, and no one wanted to get into anything with Big George, as he was often called. One time, George and another man from the area clashed, and the story is that the man now wearing dentures because George did an extraction on all his front teeth with his mighty right hand. Millie could often be heard crying after the beating that George gave her, and she would say that if only he would stop drinking the rum, he would be alright, but whenever he drank that rum, he turns into a madman, and she had to run for covers. Unfortunately, most of the time she never got to covers because the licks started. One day, the neighbors noticed that there was no noise coming from the house where Millie and George lived, but nobody paid attention. It was probably because George had finally come to some realization and stopped beating up on poor Millie. Days and nights rolled on and things were quiet. It was almost like if a sudden peace and calm came over the entire village. What made it really strange too is that nobody was seeing Millie. Like she just up and disappeared one time. Well, some of the people in the neighborhood started to ask questions, and a few brave ones, and they weren't many, even walked up to George and asked him, bull-faced, where Millie gone? The answer was always the same. And if he did tell them to mind their own business, he would say in that big, rough voice, she gone to Brazil. So talk got around that Millie gone to Brazil, and whenever another neighbor asked, someone would say, George tell me she gone to Brazil. Now, this didn't stop the people from being curious because they wanted to know how Millie could up just so and gone Brazil without letting anyone know, and all kind of rumors started to spread. They say how Millie ran away and left George because she couldn't take the beating anymore. And George, of course, would curse anyone he heard saying that and telling them, you lying in hell, I tell when she gone to Brazil. So the entire village accepted that Millie gone to Brazil. Hey, they had a little boy. His name was Jerry. And the saying was that Jerry could see ghosts. So people used to treat him like he was some sort of freak or he had the plague. None of the other children would play with Jerry because they were all scared of him. They say sometimes in the middle of playing, he would just shout out, look, that man there, and go on to describe some person from the village who had recently died. It so happened that one day, Jerry and his mother, Miss Aline, was crossing the hill overlooking Sixman's Bay, and as he passed by the old abandoned well on the plantation land, just opposite where the 6 old rusty cannons stood perched, pointing out to sea, he made a sudden stop, glaring at the well, and shouted, Ma, a woman just jumped in that well. Miss Aline, of course, tried to allay his fears by telling him that it was only his imagination, but Jerry would have none of it, and he kept insisting, yes, Ma, I see she. She got on a blue dress and an old hat. Miss Aline was a God-fearing woman who went to church every Sunday, but right then she had a different kind of fear because she recalled one person that she knew had a blue dress and always wore an old straw hat. That person was Millie. Word got around that the boy who could see ghosts had seen poor Millie jumping into Sixman's plantation's well, and people started to gather from all over the district. Somebody called the police. One old man yelled, like we got murder on we hands. The police and the fire service arrived at the well, and the entire village watched as they put the ladder down the well and descended into the bowels of the earth. People stand up there with bated breaths, just waiting to see what these firemen would find down in the well. And it wasn't too long before they saw Millie's lifeless body hauled from the depths of the abandoned well, dressed in a faded blue dress with an old straw hat covering her face. Talk started to spread like wildfire, not only throughout the northern district of Sixman's Bay, but right across the entire island of Barbados. The attention of the people gathered soon turned to George, and they started wondering where he gone. Somebody suggested that he might have followed Millie to Brazil, but we all know now Millie don't go to Brazil because it would appear that she and George had one big fight, and that particular night he went too far and cut her up with his razor. After he see the amount of blood and realizing that she was dead, all he could do was try and hide the body while making sure he cleaned up the place real good. So it was in Sixman's plantation well that George decided to dump Millie's body. He figured that it was as good as a place as any, since no one really frequented that area and the well was fairly deep. The thing that George didn't count on was the little boy Jerry. And if Miss Aline didn't decide to cut across the hill when she did, and then Jerry seeing the spirit of Millie jumping in the well, We would never know that Millie's lifeless body was lying in the bottom, all cut up and tangled in some catware. It seemed like George tossed in the catware after he dumped the body into the well. George, the bad man, was nowhere to be found. As a matter of fact, since rumors spread that the little boy saw the spirit of a woman jump into the well, nobody ain't see George. It was as though he just disappeared into thin air. But then somebody spotted George sitting under a mammy apple tree and called the police. Soon sirens were heard all through the village, heading for the mammy apple tree where George sat, with his back leaning on the tree trunk and staring into space. When he heard the sirens, George tried getting up, but each time he would fall back. And even when the police got there and was approaching him, he tried to move, but something was holding him to the ground. Poor George couldn't move from the spot. People say the last thing they heard George uttering was, "Oh God, I didn't mean to kill her. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Millie, oh God, forgive me." Miss Levine said they covered up the well after that, and it has remained abandoned to this day. That's the end of our story. I want to thank you for listening. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell. And listen up for more new stories coming from WOOS.